Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. The Road to Autonomy is brought to you in part by Stantec Generation AV. Stantec Generation AV combines some of the most experienced AV experts in the industry with the resources of a global engineering firm. Stantec Generation AV provides education, consulting, assessment, and guidance to any industry interested in autonomous vehicles. Learn more at stantec.com. Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. On today's podcast, we're absolutely honored to have Sam Abidi, Chief Commercial Officer Embark Trucks. Welcome to the podcast, Sam.
Hey, Grayson. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you here. You're the second representative from Embark. You've got to follow in the shadow of Johnny Morris, who did a wonderful job. So excited to have you here because Johnny told the policy story for Embark, and I'm hoping that today you can shed a light on the commercialization story for Embark.
Happy to. Johnny's a tough act to follow.
Well, something tells me, and I know personally that you're a good guy. And so you're going to tell that story because there's a lot to tell about Embark. Embark went public on the NASDAQ in November 2021. As a pre-revenue public company, how are you approaching commercialization?
At Embark, we really think about two things. I'd say the first is a focused use case, and then the second is around a partnership-based business model. So I think one of the unique things about Embark is from day one, all the way back in 2016, we saw trucking as the application for autonomy because it was the most limited use case. You could stay on highway, you could stay focused in your tech stack development. And I think that attribute of being focused in everything we do expands beyond just the tech development. And then the other half of this is around a partnership-based business model. There's a world where an AV player tries to vertically integrate and grow their own fleet and deploy that way. And then there's a world where you work with the existing players in the ecosystem, large carriers, tier ones, OEMs, shippers, all of whom have decades of experience doing what they're great at. So if you take the carrier, for example, they have immense expertise in setting up networks, running trucks efficiently. They buy thousands of trucks a year. Embark really sat back and thought we could either try to recreate the wheel here, or we could leverage the expertise of all of these businesses, and we chose the latter. And I'd say that that's another guiding principle of ours. Between those two things, it pretty much leads us to a model where we focus on software development, developing autonomous software that can drive Class 8 trucks on highway. And we look to our partners to do everything else. We expect to scale operations by way of our carriers who will haul goods for the shippers that we work with. And we expect to work with tier ones and OEMs to deliver that. That's really a little bit about how we plan to commercialize. It's a rather unique approach that's kind of driven by some humility on what the freight ecosystems managed to accomplish before we even got here.
How much of that's driven by discipline? Because knowing your founding team, going back to 2016, there was never any talk, we're going to go into cars. There was no Embark's Trucks. And there was this discipline when robo-taxis were all the hype. Well, Embark, work on cars. And it was no trucks. Is that where that discipline comes in now as you're growing?
We saw it serve us well. You could argue if you're standing in 2017, we probably looked a little silly working on these huge trucks and trying to automate them driving down the highway. But we had belief that focus was the mechanism by which you get to market quickly. And then a lot of the market kind of came around to that belief in time. And really all that did for us is double down. So every time we look at a new development effort, a new partnership, whatever it might be, we think, is this on the critical path? Is this a focused aspect of getting us to market? If it's not, don't pursue it. If it needs to be done, figure out if you can partner. And if not, develop it yourself.
I do want to give a shout out. Your team brought Big Blue, which I believe was one of your first or second demo trucks, to Joshua's self-racing cars. And I was like, oh, wow, Big Blue is going to go around the racetrack. You didn't put Big Blue around the racetrack, but it was there with all the cars. And you had a presence in that community. And you built and fostered. I'm probably sure you probably hired some engineers from that community as well.
Big Blue, I think, is a point of pride for us. It's one of the oldest autonomous trucks in America. It's been through a lot of miles. A lot of software has been developed on it. A lot of the features of the truck today that run were developed on that way back in the day. We try to bring Big Blue out wherever we can.
Does Big Blue live in the Embark PR office and we need to roll it out? Big Blue comes out?
No. Big Blue still gets some miles. It does some photo shoots, but it's actually still getting some miles and collecting data and contributing to the engineering mission. I'd like to believe it'll never retire, but we'll see.
That'd be awesome. It's the oldest living self-driving truck that's still going. Go Big Blue. May you go hundreds of thousands, if not millions of more miles. And you look at millions of miles, you have great professional drivers and large companies. And one of those companies is a partner of yours, Knight Swift, a humongous company. You have a partnership with them where they're going to own, maintain, and deploy the autonomous trucks with their own safety drivers. Can you talk about that deal, please?
This is one of the most exciting things we're doing in 22. So The idea here is I spoke a little bit about our business model where we're vehement that the carriers are the owner operators. If you believe that to be the way by which you scale, then it's important to get ahead of that preparation process. It's not the case that these are going to be one for one replacements for human driven trucks. They're going to have a lot of nuance around how they deploy. Everything from new and more comprehensive pre-inspection procedures to unique maintenance to dispatching, which is going to be more complicated. And all of that needs to be worked out, not in a lab by Embark, but with the carriers who will actually be responsible for it. Knight-Swift is one of the best operators in the industry, and so we're lucky to be able to develop the playbook here with them. The idea behind this program is it's an industry-first instance of a carrier taking ownership of an L4 truck and beginning to run it with a safety driver behind the wheel for the purposes of generating the operational playbook by which you could do this with tens, hundreds, thousands of trucks in the future. We're in the first inning of that journey. We kicked off at the beginning of this year the process to essentially develop all the material needed to hand them the trucks, and we're targeting delivering trucks at the end of 22 for running in 2023. It's a really exciting program. We've learned a lot already, and I think there's a whole bunch more to figure out between now and deployment and as we actually start running the trucks.
You mentioned pre-inspection. Reminds me of when you see the pilot go around the plane, if you're flying a commercial plane where they're going to check the tires and the fuselage. Is that a very similar analogy to what you're describing?
Yeah, and actually in this instance, we Embark are not reinventing the wheel. There exists a DOT pre-inspection for Class 8 trucks that happen on every truck that you see on the road today when it leaves out for its drive. What's unique about AV is there's not only the need to do that base inspection with a high level of fidelity, but there's also an incremental set of inspection steps that need to happen specific to the AV component of the truck. Getting all of those denoted properly and getting drivers at Knight-Swift trained to be able to do that is a big part of this program. And you can expect it to be a big part of the industry in general. Inspections are a huge consideration today, and they become only more important in a future where autonomous trucks, there's so much on the line and getting that pre-inspection ready because you're setting the truck off by itself.
So you're building upon, so you have a professional driver that understands the wear and tear on the tires. They understand if it's hitched right. Are they going through a training program or classes? Okay, this is how a LiDAR works. This is how a camera works, and kind of learning about all the components as they do their pre-inspection. Well, that's not right. We need to call a technician where they know to notify a technician.
It's exactly that. So today, when we bring a driver into the Embark team to help be part of our safety driving workforce, they are CDL holding drivers. They typically have quite exceptional careers because they're being used to train the system. But the first thing we do with them is we actually put them through a rather extensive training program that hits a lot of the points that you mentioned here. It's learning how the system is set up. What are the different components? How does the AV system think? So that they can kind of get inside of its head so that when they're monitoring, they understand what's likely to happen next. Because this truck has a character of its own. It's a driver. And so you're training our drivers who will be monitoring it to understand how it thinks. Because that's the safest way to essentially be a safety driver behind the wheel of one of these trucks.
To me, it sounds the safe driver has to have a sense of pride. They're learning something new. They're being a part of the future. Are there any great stories where a professional driver says, Sam, this is cool. Did you see what it did? It avoided a potential crash. Are you getting any feedback like that?
This is a high calling for a driver, in my opinion. Many of these drivers have done hundreds of thousands, if not a million plus miles. They're essentially joining us to impart their wisdom on the truck. And they take immense pride in that. I think one of the most notable things is when we're encountering some sort of complexity or issue with how the truck is behaving, essentially a defective behavior. And the drivers are helping us understand how to correct that. And then in subsequent releases of the code, they actually see that behavior begin to happen correctly. And you do see a big smile light up on their face because that's effectively them having taught the truck, working with the engineers to make that standard behavior. And then moving forward, that lesson that they imparted on the vehicle goes into every single future test vehicle and eventually commercial vehicle that we deploy. So I think there's a lot for our drivers to be proud of through the training of our trucks.
Is it a fair statement to say that Embark's professional drivers are playing a critical role in developing the technology based on their years of experience?
Absolutely. I'd say that's an understatement. I'd say that their expertise is one of the most critical aspects of getting the technology developed.
When you deliver, let's use Knight-Swift for example, is that the Embark Universal Interface that you're delivering to them? What does that handoff process look like?
The Embark Universal Interface, just to kind of back up, is essentially a system that was born out of feedback that we received from carriers throughout the years. If you go into any large fleet today, they buy from multiple OEMs. And they want the components that get put on those OEM trucks, like the AV system, to look similar across the truck, whether it's OEM type 1 or OEM type 2. And so we set out on a rather large effort to develop a standardized set of sensors and compute with flexible mounts and communication interfaces so that our AV system could go from one OEM to another. Now, obviously, there is a deep integration that has to occur with the OEMs in order to get these systems integrated. But the idea of going through a program like this is when one of our large carriers is running the trucks across multiple OEM brands, the system looks similar and is maintainable in a similar way. This is a pretty key aspect of the Embark story and is the system that we'll be installing on the trucks to be delivered to Knightswift at the end of the year.
All right. I'm a giant kid at heart. So if I go on a small world ride at Disneyland versus a small world ride at Disney World, they're very similar. And it's that same experience. And my daughter's very happy because it's a small world after all. And we're all happy. Is that very similar into what Embark's doing?
That is the objective. I've yet to hear that analogy used, but that is the objective. I was going to give you some boring analogy about tier 1 components and how they get standardized across OEMs, but I like yours better.
Oh, thanks. From a standards perspective, like the small world, you go in a certain order, and there's a standard way to develop the small world ride, which was actually developed for the World's Fair, if we want to go way back in the Wayback Machine. So when you're putting it on Knightswift Truck 1, and then say you're going to put on Acme Truck 2, another partner of yours, is it the same layout? Your engineers know where to put all the hardware. It's all that's called standardized?
That's the exact idea. Now, obviously, there is iterations because we're still in the R&D phase of this. But yes, the idea is you could probably list out 10, 12 dimensions that make up an AD system. And our goal is to come as close to standard on each of them across the different brands. You can almost think about it as, I sometimes give the example that if you imagine where a particular sensor could be mounted, you can create a Venn diagram for each one of the OEMs, and there's an overlap in the middle of a location that works for all four. That's an example of a kind of decision that we may work towards to make this more universal.
It's scalable.
That is the hope. That is the goal.
Is it a long integration process? If you have truck manufacturer 1, truck manufacturer 2, once you learn how to work on that truck, does that speed up the process so you add more and more trucks online from the same manufacturer?
Like anything, there's a learning curve. And now we're definitely getting into the details, but there's kind of cutoffs at certain volumes where your process that you take begins to change. So you go from a more custom process of getting the system onto the truck to a more systematic line type process for getting the system onto the truck. There's all these cutoffs at different volumes that necessitate you to essentially move through different processes to get it done.
And you look at different processes, to me, first thing comes to weather. Embark's the first company to test on public roads in snowy conditions in Montana. There's a great Frank Zappa song about Montana. We don't have to get into that now, but do you have to change the sensor configuration when you're running in the northern part of the United States in snowy conditions versus the Sun Belt, which is hot?
There's a lot to be said about the configuration that needs to be done for different regions of the U.S. The test in Montana was actually mostly focused around our Vision Map Fusion system and testing the capabilities of that. And just to maybe back up for the audience, so Embark takes a rather unique approach to how we localize ourselves inside of the world, essentially how we identify where we are on the road. Most systems that are built from the bottom up for robotaxis use what's called HD maps. These are essentially really, really detailed pictures of the world, and then we essentially locate ourselves within that. Because Embark was focused on highway, we use a technique called Vision Map Fusion, which relies on a higher order map, essentially simpler geometries that it is easier to identify yourself against. And because we took that approach, really what it does is it allows us to be resilient to changes in the map, whether it's a construction zone or snow on the side of the road. And so because we'd taken this fundamental approach years ago, it allowed us to go test in snow. And we wanted to see how well the system would perform in snowy conditions. The test was really focused on seeing this particular software system's application with the existing sensor suites. And we proved that it could handle some pretty adverse scenarios that we were impressed and excited about.
If it can handle those situations, that opens up the northern part of the United States, and it opens up Canada. Canada, the long roads, it's a long way from Toronto to Vancouver. And your founder, one of your co-founders, Alex Rodriguez, not the baseball player, the cool engineer from Waterloo, Does that open up an opportunity to expand into Alex's home country of Canada?
The way that we thought about this testing, our plan remains to open up the Sun Belt in 24 and then begin opening the northern half of the US in 26. But really what this testing was about is the fact that even in the Sun Belt or even in the lower 48, the trucking companies that we work with today experience snow on a regular basis. It snows inside the Sun Belt. It snows plenty inside the rest of the lower 48. Those cause operations disruptions. And so this was essentially a program to figure out how often we could handle those operations disruptions with the current technology's capabilities. The way that we saw it is it's 2022. There's only so many winters between now and 26. And so we wanted to start figuring out where the boundaries are on the system so that we can improve it towards our existing timeline goals.
That's a very valid point, because if you have in Southern California, you have the Cajon Pass, which is Ontario to Vegas. You have to go through there. It snows. I got stuck in a snowstorm there and the road was shut down. Are those situations that you're looking when you're going through, you want to call it the mountain passes, the Sun Belt, if you're going to go from, say, Ontario to Atlanta?
I wouldn't say we're hunting for mountain passes on the tech. We definitely do a lot of thinking about what the simplest and easiest lanes for the technology to handle are. But even on those, like a great example is Dallas to Atlanta. It's not uncommon that you may cross a snow day or two there a year. And if your system's able to properly handle those light snow situations, that's a big relief to the carrier that you're working with and the shipper whose goods are being moved against it.
I'm going back into Disney. Sorry. Are you considering that the next frontier to be able to drive through light snow?
No. I would say that we have a handful of capabilities that we outlined as kind of more near-term critical than that to be able to do some year-based operations.
Where are you seeing the most demand from your partners for deployments?
We spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about this with our partners. We've actually devised a network assessment process that we walk through with most of the major carriers. What this entails is they give us a whole bunch of lane level data about where they move goods today. And then we actually analyze that to figure out what the most attractive lane in their network is and what the next most attractive and the one after that. And when we do this, we consider a couple of factors. And this is really how we get to where their demand is coming from. We look for lanes that exacerbate the benefits of autonomous. What I mean by that is these trucks can run 24/7. And so long lanes that are over 600 miles. So at 600 miles, a human driver has to effectively stop for the evening because there are hours of service. A lane that's 650 miles gets done in 13, 14 hours by an autonomous truck, but it actually takes over 24 hours for a human-driven truck to do. And so that's an example of where we have an outsized benefit to our carrier partner relative to the alternative. Examples like that kind of continue to generate. So we provide fuel savings when you don't have to stop overnight. Safety is bigger on roads where there are lots of incidents. Given all of these factors, we're able to come out with lanes that are most attractive and immediate for our partners and lanes that we can wait a little longer because the parity is almost there. It's not surprising. It's the major power lanes in the Sun Belt that are over 600 miles, things like LA to Dallas, Dallas to Atlanta. Those are the kinds of lanes where you could expect this technology to be deployed first and then expand out to the other lanes in the Sun Belt before we actually open up the northern half.
When you're looking at the lanes in the Sun Belt, how much of it comes down to economics, where your partner says, okay, Sam, this is a profitable route. We'd like to explore this route with you?
Economics is a big part of the equation. I would actually say, though, most of our partners think about the first benefit as added capacity. Today, the carriers that we work with have thousands of trucks, in some cases tens of thousands of trucks. They are still rejecting shipments day and night. There's this concept called tender rejection rate. It's how often a carrier says no to a load, and that fluctuates all the way up to 25% of the time. When we talk to carriers, thing one is how can you supplement my existing driver workforce? A lot of people think that these trucks are really built to replace human drivers, but I expect in all the carriers that we work with that these will actually supplement and work alongside the existing human driver workforce. And so a lot of the conversation with our carriers is around which lanes are they struggling to staff the most. And it tends to be, like I said earlier, there's longer lanes because it doesn't allow drivers to get home at night. And so what this creates is this opportunity for Embark trucks to be deployed by the carriers in the long lanes, let the drivers shift back to the shorter lanes, and then the carrier can end up in a position where they're not having to decline as many loads. And by virtue of that, they actually grow top line revenue. We talk with a lot of carriers about this concept of how these things will kind of play together.
How large of a shortage is there in terms of capacity? Because to me, we're record high in 40-year high inflation, 8.3%. the cost of goods are going up. You just go to the grocery store, you see it there. Is that kind of adding that inflation where there's not enough drivers for the capacity?
I would definitely say that the supply chain, and if you peel that onion back, the driver shortage does contribute to inflation and is contributing to inflation. We've seen kind of the ebb and flow of goods availability, the fact that many people still don't have the couch that they ordered a year ago. That's a direct result of the total supply chain, both China shipping and the US network, not just the driver shortage. But the driver shortage is a major contributor to the supply chain issues and therefore the inflation.
Your CEO, Alex, recently did an interview, I believe it was Fox Business, about the positive benefits of autonomous trucking on the supply chain, which will inherently lower inflation and be good for the U.S. economy. Alex delivered a wonderful message on TV. Why are politicians not talking about the positive benefits autonomous trucking will have on the economy? Because it will benefit every single member of the country.
If you back up and look over the last couple of years of the development of autonomous trucking, I think it's quite interesting. 4 years ago, no one was talking about autonomous trucks at all. Now you've kind of brought on side a couple of players. The AV industry has come on side. Some of the best engineers in the AV industry now flock to trucking companies, AV trucking companies, because it's the application that they think they can get to market first. And then on the supply chain side, carriers kind of talked about it as this real futuristic Jetsons thing. And now they see it as a real opportunity. And they put a lot of management team time into working with us and others to essentially prepare for deployment. We're just kind of slowly knocking down the dominoes. The engineers are here now. The freight ecosystem is here now. And I think next is politicians and the public perception. It's a complicated story. You've got to have a second order understanding of how supply chains work. You've got to understand hours of service. You've got to understand relay networks and hub networks to really recognize how autonomy unlocks e-commerce and 2-day delivery and everyone's desire for cheap goods. I think that politicians are slowly starting to digest that as this bubbles up as a major topic. And I think the swell is there. It's been exciting to watch it kind of develop over the last 12 months.
It has been exciting. And to me, the turning point was when second graders and third graders started talking about the supply chain. I said, wait a second. Now you know something's up.
Yep. I would agree.
Because then the parents who vote are going to say, my child wasn't able to get the Christmas gifts because you won't allow autonomous trucks. Okay, we're going to vote you out and put a pro-autonomous trucking politician in. I think you're going to see stuff like that where the parents are saying enough's enough. And we're going to see in the midterms with the inflation. And inflation is nasty. And autonomous trucking, as I've said many times, will help to reduce inflation. Let's get autonomous trucking going for the United States. And while I'm at it, we need a national framework so Sam and the wonderful team at Embark can go over state lines and go where the customer demand is. Sam, from an economic perspective, what is the Embark revenue miles? The more miles you drive, the more money you make? What does it look like?
So at our core, we're an AV SaaS company. So it's exactly that. Our plan is to collect a per mile fee from carriers. The way that we think about this is essentially we need to set them up to run effectively and efficiently so that we can collect more revenue from them utilizing the trucks. The thing that we provide for that per mile fee are essentially two things: AV software that can navigate the truck on highways, and then what we call Guardian, which is our fleet management system that essentially assists with dispatching, monitoring, over-the-air updates, and a couple of the other ancillary things that a carrier needs support with when they have a truck that has no driver in the seat. We essentially provide those services in exchange for a per mile fee and really work closely with the carrier to set them up to scale. A lot of the carriers that we work with today, across the set, it's tens of thousands of trucks. If you do the legwork today, the scalability is quite enormous.
Over-the-air updates are one of the single greatest inventions for a human-driven passenger car, for an autonomous truck. It changes the game, and it's going to allow you to scale your business. Why and how did you make the decision to fully embrace over-the-air updates?
The decision here is quite obvious if you look at the complexity of these systems. And I think you'll see, I wouldn't even say you will see, I think you are seeing this becoming standard behavior as our vehicles running down the road are majority software. The number of processors on the vehicle and the number of operating systems and applications that are running has been growing exponentially. And so the ability to update that over the air saves you a tremendous amount of maintenance and in-shop servicing in a way that never was the case 3 or even 5 years ago.
It makes it for your partners the cost efficiency to operate it. It's a no-brainer. Really, truly is.
Absolutely. I think it only becomes more important as you think about the context in which our trucks are used. The fact that these are commercial vehicles, uptime and utilization is the name of the game. It's the number one thing that a lot of these carriers track. As we think about both technical design and operational design, everything revolves around managing and improving uptime.
And when you look at improving uptime, you have two great partnerships. You got one with Ryder. Mike Blensky, shout out, sir. You're awesome. Then you got US Express. What role will those partnerships play in uptime? Will Ryder kind of be your uptime partner with US Express, then be your load capacity partner?
Happy to talk through these, and I'll probably put them in the broader context of what we call the Embark coverage map. If we back up a little bit and we go back to one of our principles, being focused, Embark is really developing a truck that can drive between predefined points on a map, terminals in major markets, from those terminals to the highway, then on the highway, and then off the highway to another terminal. Because that is our operating model, it requires us to essentially establish this nationwide network of terminals. And the way that we think about this being done is there's really two phases. In phase one, there are a set of terminals that we, Embark, provide to our carrier partners, between which they can run. These terminals are provided by folks like Altera, which is a real estate company that we partnered with to essentially set up terminals that our carriers can use. And then once a truck shows up at one of those terminals, we actually recently struck a partnership with Ryder. And the idea here is Ryder will provide the on-site services needed. So if you imagine a truck without a driver showing up at a terminal in LA, someone's got to let it into the gate, someone's got to drive it to the parking spot, change the trailer, pre-inspect it, set it up for launch, and release it. You want that experience to be consistent, whether that truck is showing up in LA or Dallas or Atlanta. And Ryder has both a nationwide footprint and expertise in these type of activities. We see Ryder as the partner that's going to help provide those services across the country. And then Altera is the real estate provider that provides the actual sites. And that gets you the first half of the way there. That gets you a network that Embark has really provided to carrier partners. But as volume grows, the priming of the pump that we did in the first phase won't be sufficient. And the carriers that we work with will want to go directly to their terminals like they do today, and they'll want to go directly to shipper facilities. And so that requires us to begin mapping those sites in. And the first instance of us doing that is the work we're doing with US Express, where we're looking at their terminal network and identifying the sites which will see the most volume, and then beginning to figure out the processes so that they can run autonomous trucks directly to their terminal. And then these two things together really help you create a large, dense network of sites between which our trucks can run. And that's how you serve the U.S. logistics network.
From a consistency standpoint, that goes back to my Swall World analogy. It's simple as that.
Yes, I hope I've conveyed it as simple. I think us and our partners work pretty hard to make it so, but yes, as simple as that.
I love this. From an infrastructure standpoint, what has to be updated and enhanced for the autonomous trucks to fully utilize the terminals? Do you have to put in fueling, charging, bunk beds? What does that look like?
We actually talk a lot about this with our Ryder partners. We try to think about it as what you must have and what's nice to have, and we try to make the must have quite minimal. If you think about your minimum configuration for a terminal, it's actually not that different from what a trucking terminal looks like today. You need fencing, you need a gate, you need a decent, strong internet connection, and you need power for the trucks. And you can really get away with that as your base configuration, because that gate allows for security, that internet allows for over-the-air updates, the power allows the truck to be plugged in so the compute can keep running. Regular old parking spots allow you to do the transfers, and then you launch by the other gate. However, it gets really interesting when you start to think about what's nice to have. And I think most of the nice to have items here are along the dimension of improving efficiency. Like we said earlier, uptime is critical, and you'd want the truck to be able to get everything it needs at this site versus having to go to a second or third site to get all the things done. And so from there, you start to think about things like on-site fueling or ability to run some simple diagnostics, run simple maintenance activities like tire changes. And those kinds of things start to get added to the list. But again, I think it's going to be a majority of rather simple sites and then a small set of sites that have some of these additional features. And you'll be balancing that with the goal of uptime.
Do you determine where the features go based on the amount of cargo that's going through that facility or the amount of trucks that are going through there? So you just run a mathematical equation. Hypothetically, we're going to have to replace tires more at this depot versus the other depot?
I'd say it's not as linear or straightforward as that, but that is the concept. You work with your carrier partners and you work with folks like Ryder to understand where certain services are typically demanded, where a truck will be in its duty cycle when it arrives there. And that helps guide you towards what's needed at those particular sites. But I would say it's not as neat of a science as you'd hope. I think there is a little bit of art here and a little bit of recognizing that you don't know everything about how the network is going to develop over time.
We don't know a lot about a lot. If you asked me 18 months ago if the price of diesel average would be $5.52 a gallon, I would say you're absolutely crazy. Trucks go long distances. They're getting expensive to fuel. Are you looking at alternative forms of fuel such as hydrogen or electrification?
I would agree with you. I also would have called you crazy, but here we are. I would say even before diesel prices took off, this is something we thought about a lot. The way that we see this, and it's not dissimilar from a lot of the partnership-based business model comments I've been making throughout the discussion, we look forward to a platform that can run on electric or hydrogen for the distances that make sense for autonomy. Autonomous typically is most applicable, as I mentioned earlier, on these long hauls. And right now, most of the electrical and hydrogen solutions are more fitting to local moves. As the range starts to come up, we fully expect that in the long run, our system will sit on top of hydrogen electric. And if you think about it from a technological perspective, it is not some Herculean task to get an AV system to work on those platforms. Because at the end of the day, we're sending throttle, braking, and steering commands. And whether that throttle is powering an electric motor or a diesel engine, it looks roughly the same. There's obviously a development effort to make the adaptation, but it's not a hindrance. It's not something that would stop you from actually making the progress.
In other words, is the Embark Universal Interface fuel agnostic?
You could say that the system has attributes that make it easier to move between fuel types.
Okay.
But by virtue of trying to make commands standard, it makes it easier to move across fuel types.
We talked about terminals. One thing that I love your opinion on, because I've been doing an immense amount of research and can't get any answer from anybody, is when are we actively going to see autonomous trucks going to ports and picking up goods? So perhaps you can go from a port to a terminal.
You're referring to like Port of LA or Port of Savannah or things of that nature?
Correct.
This is a really interesting area that we had some conversations around and done some analysis around. I think ports are high on the list of places that you would expect to be mapped into something like the Embark coverage map. And I can kind of give a bit of rationale here. A lot of the goods that land at port have above average haul distances because on average, they're moving quite a long distance to get to the center of the country or further up or down the coast on which they've landed. It's a rather attractive set of loads. They're rather densely concentrated in one area. And those two things work to the advantage of AV, which wants to pick up from one spot, so it doesn't have to learn a whole bunch of new stuff, and wants to take loads a long distance. I think there's a lot of attractiveness around port freight volume.
We see the traffic. I'll give you an example. Could we see something in the future, perhaps a consistent run multiple times a day from, let's just say, LA to Ontario or LA out to in the San Marino Valley where they're building a new World Logistics Center? Could we see consistent runs like that where they're fixed routes operating multiple times a day, or is that too short of a route?
I'll never say never, but I will say, to your point, we are targeting market-to-market moves. It more often would be grabbing loads from the port that are destined for other markets, whether it be Phoenix or Dallas.
The best part about that is you're adding capacity. We can unclog the ports faster, which goes back to the inflation comment and I meant earlier. So thank you for shedding an honest opinion on ports. I really appreciate it. And Sam, from your perspective, what are your thoughts on the current state of the autonomous trucking industry as a whole?
I think it's beyond an exciting time to be in this. I mentioned a little bit about this earlier, but I just think the progress of knocking down constituents and bringing them on side over the last couple of years has just been consistent and energizing. Whether it's the AV industry at large, the freight ecosystem, started with shippers who are on board, then carriers, and then now I think it moves on to the next stage where the general public and the political climate begins to get excited about the technology. And so you're seeing this momentum. I'm just excited to be along for the ride and watch it continue over the next couple of years.
The momentum's definitely building. The industry is only going to get bigger. The industry is going to have a positive impact on the United States economy. And as we look to wrap up this super insightful conversation, Sam, what would you like our listeners to take away with them today?
I actually think it'd be exactly that point. We talked a lot about the nuance of Embark and our business model and things of that nature. But I think if you just zoom out, the impact that this has on our society is just something that we don't, I think, pause enough to think about. Right now, everyone expects goods to be here in 2 days. Everyone has some item that they're not able to get that they've ordered recently. And these are the types of things that, if done right, if a whole bunch of people work together just right, ourselves, the freight ecosystem, politicians, etc., then we have a chance to essentially eliminate some of those downside scenarios and actually meet the goals on some of those other things, for whether it be expedited delivery. And that makes a real difference in everyone's life, whether you're involved in the space or not. And I think that that's kind of an exciting thing to remember.
It makes a real difference, but more importantly, it makes a positive difference. It will have a positive impact on your wallet because autonomous trucks are good for society because the future is bright, the future is autonomous, and the future is Embark. Sam, thank you so much for coming on the Road to Autonomy today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me again.
Thank you for listening to the Road to Autonomy podcast. If you've enjoyed listening, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter at Road to Autonomy or email podcast@brulteco.com. The Road to Autonomy is produced by Brulte & Company. The views and opinions expressed on the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Brulte & Company. The content discussed on this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as legal, tax, investment, or business advice.